Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Adam, and I'm a park interpreter here in Whiteshell Provincial Park. Now, the Whiteshell is located on Treaty 3 territory. That's the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, and Métis Nation. Now, both historically as well as today, Indigenous peoples fished primarily for sustenance. Fishing is also a very popular year-round recreational activity for really everybody. And a lot of the fishing opportunities we have in Manitoba are actually available to us thanks to the Whiteshell Fish Hatchery. Now, the Whiteshell Fish Hatchery was started in 1942, and it is a provincial sport fish hatchery. So what that means is that the hatchery's sole purpose is to spawn, raise, and stock out fish strictly for people to go catch. There's no commercial sales, there's no private sales. The hatchery's, again, sole purpose is just to put fish out in Manitoba for people to go catch. Now, this is a very interesting place that we're going to take a look at today. But for starters, we're going to just take a look at really how many fish are we talking here. Manitoba is very large, so really how many fish are we thinking? The hatchery stocks out lots of fish, not just the ones behind me here, but the main one in terms of how many are stocked out is actually this one right here. Most of you should probably recognize this. This is our provincial fish, the walleye. And again, this fish is stocked out in the highest numbers, and I mean millions. Take our online poll here really quick to see if you can figure out how many walleye are stocked out of the Whiteshell Fish Hatchery every year. And again, those aren't typos. Millions of walleye are stocked out. Is it 1 to 2, 9 to 13, 2 to 5? We'll see what you guys think here. In any of those cases, that's a heck of a lot of fish to be stocked out of one facility here. And our survey says, alrighty, about almost 3/4 of you say 9 to 13 million. Those of you that said that are absolutely correct. Every year, the Whiteshell Fish Hatchery stocks out, again, between 9 to 13 million walleye. And one of the most unique things about this is, yes, they're stocked out in the highest numbers, but the time frame that the walleye are actually at the hatchery is the shortest. Some of our other fish that are stocked out, like rainbow trout or brown trout here, some of them can be kept for up to 15 to 18 months before they're released. So that's over a year. Back to our walleye, however, from the time that the eggs are laid to where the fish are released is about 6 to 7 weeks. That's a really fast period. But even before that, we have to answer a question. How do we get our eggs? Well, the fish hatchery staff actually manually spawn what's called a broodstock. Broodstock is a fancy term for the adult fish that are kept strictly to get the eggs from. So how do we go about doing that? Well, for starters, before we even grab our fish, because again, it is manual, the first thing we have to do is put on a pair of either wool or nylon gloves. Now, the reason for this is because, and if anyone's held a fish before, you know that fish are actually really slimy. Now, the gloves are not being worn because fish are slimy and gross. If you don't like touching fish, probably shouldn't work at a fish hatchery. But it does have something to do with the slime. The slime on the fish is actually a protective layer, and it keeps fish safe from bacteria and diseases under the water. It doesn't work too well outside of the water. Whatever we may have on our hands, things like bug spray, sunscreen, maybe our 10th layer of hand sanitizer for the day, all that stuff can keep us safe, but it can actually make the fish very sick. So that's one of the reasons we want to wear gloves. Another reason for that is we want a really good grip, because some of the fish that we're spawning can be, again, as big as this walleye down here. So now that we got our gloves on, we grab our fish just by the tail here. And again, when the fish are out of water, hence the phrase, they don't want to be there. So they're going to be moving around quite a bit. After we have our fish by the tail, we take its head and stick it under their armpit just like that. Now, why in the world would we do this? Two basic reasons. For starters, again, the fish can be very large and wiggling around a lot, so we want a good grip for what we're going to do. Plus, under our armpit, it's dark, same as it is underwater. So when they're put in a dark environment, they kind of calm down a little bit, which is good for what we're going to do. Now, lastly, we take our finger or our thumb, and then we move it down the fish's belly, just like this. And that makes all the eggs come out. What would happen in the wild is a female fish would come along in a river, and with her belly, just kind of dig a little nest. Fish nest is actually called a redd, spelled R-E-D-D. Then the male fish would come along and scrape the side of the female's belly with their tail, making the eggs come out. So that's what we're simulating with our thumb going down the fish's belly. At that same time, the female would also be scraping the male fish's belly, which makes the milk come out. The eggs are fertilized right there. The female buries the nest and takes off, never to be seen again. Very good parenting in the fishing world. Now, we don't just let all the eggs spray out all over the place. We do have bowls, and all the eggs go into bowls about this big. Now, it only takes about 3 to 4 fish the size of this brown trout right here to fill this bowl completely with eggs. And then once we have the fertilized eggs, we take them up into the main hatchery building, and they go into one of 2 containers. Warm water fish like walleye will go into jars like these. So in this jar, this hose would obviously be connected to a water system. Water constantly flows in, goes down, comes up, and exits out through the top here. With the water constantly flowing, it simulates what it's like in a river. And they're also equipped with little stir sticks should the eggs need to be stirred at any time. And as far as these jars go with the walleye eggs, this jar can hold between 200 to 250,000 eggs. So 4 of these jars is 1 million. Needless to say, they have a lot of these jars. Cold water fish, like our trout, will go in trays like this. So these trays are designed to hang just like this, and they are lined in long troughs that we'll see in just a second, with water constantly flowing through and the eggs placed inside. Once the eggs start hatching, the fish are small enough that they can pop through those little slits there, and eventually, kind of like popcorn, when all the eggs that are going to hatch have hatched, we take the trays out and we have nice long troughs full of fish. Now, we talked quite a bit about the walleye, about how they're stocked out a lot at the fish hatchery, but of course that is not the only fish that is stocked out. Every fish behind me here and more have been stocked out of the hatchery at some point. For example, I'd be able to see this little guy here. This is a black crappie. Quite frankly, the best tasting fish that I have ever had. If you like walleye, trust me, you'll like these guys too. These guys were stocked into lakes like Star Lake and Caddy Lake a few decades ago. This fish here is called a lake trout. And yes, that's as much of him as I could actually get in the shot. These are very large fish, and actually the only native trout species we have to southern Manitoba. This is the only one you would find naturally down here. So every other year, this fish is stocked out, but not mainly as lake trout. The hatchery staff will actually go up to the paw every other year and spawn lake trout from the wild, and they'll bring the eggs back, mainly to use to make hybrids. This is where it gets kind of cool with trout. Brook trout here, like this one, the milt, which is male fish sperm, if you combine that with any trout egg, you'll get some kind of hybrid. So when you mix a brook with a lake trout, you get what's called a splake trout. The SP comes from brook trout, or sometimes known as speckled trout, with the dots they have on them. When you combine them with a rainbow trout, you get what's called a spur. With an Arctic char, you get a spar. And then with a brown trout here, you get what's called a tiger trout. But in keeping with all the fish getting stocked out, northern pike have been kept at the hatchery historically, but mostly for research purposes. And then brook, brown, and rainbow trout are stocked out pretty much statically every single year. Arctic char have been stocked out on a regular basis in the hatchery in the past, but now for the most part, they're just used to make those hybrids I talked about. And there's one more fish I'm going to show you. I couldn't fit him behind me here because as you're going to see, he's very large. Oh, and heavy. This last one here is our lake sturgeon. So this is a very, very cool fish. The last time this was stocked out of the hatchery was probably about 30 to 40 years ago. And one of the reasons that it's not stocked out anymore is the Whiteshell Fish Hatchery just doesn't have the facilities to be able to maintain a brood stock of lake sturgeon right here. For starters, this one I'm holding here, while it's a big fish, it's a baby. These fish can get quite large. Actually, the largest lake sturgeon ever caught in Manitoba weighed 405 pounds and is estimated to be about 9 feet long. That's a big fish. So needless to say, this is a teeny one. And again, the hatchery just doesn't have the facilities to be able to maintain a brood stock of fish that size. So now that we've taken a look at some of the fish that the hatchery does stock out and gotten a bit of an introduction to what the hatchery is, let's actually go there. Right now, we're going to take an in-depth look at the Whiteshell Fish Hatchery and how it operates year-round. Welcome to the Whiteshell Fish Hatchery. Today, not only are we going to get a chance to look at the outside facilities, but we're going to get a special treat and be able to go inside the main building where all the action's taking place right now and talk to some of our hatchery staff. Two things that are usually off limits to the public. It's nice outside right now, so let's take a look at the outside stuff first. These long tanks beside me here are what we call the raceways. We call them that because it looks like the fish are racing back and forth when they're inside. In each of these tanks here, there's anywhere between 30 to 50,000 trout. Three different kinds: brook, brown, or rainbow. All of these are going to get released this spring. So come this summertime, you can come to the Whiteshell or lots of other places in southern Manitoba and try to catch some of these. One of the things that's unique about this place is that all the water is gravity fed. This is because we are actually 12 feet below the surface of Westhock Lake. That's our source for the water. And that's actually one of the reasons this site was chosen back in 1942 to become the hatchery. We're drawing water from two different levels of the lake. One's coming from about 5 feet and the other one's coming from about 45 feet. So in trout world, as they're a cold water fish, that kind of means a warm water and a cold water pipe. This allows hatchery staff to regulate the temperature based on season to just about whatever they need. These next set of tanks behind me that were installed the same year that the raceways were in 1967 are now where we house our brood stock of brown trout that we'll take a look at in a second. Brown trout are special in that they're not native not only to Manitoba, but they're not native to North America. So without the Whiteshell Fish Hatchery stocking them out, we wouldn't be able to catch these here in Manitoba. All of the water that goes through all of the tanks here at the hatchery then goes through an underground system and exits into the Whiteshell River. No chemicals are ever added, so the water going through is basically just as clean as it was when it started in the first place. There's a little more fish poop and occasionally a little bit of fish food in there, but that's okay. Westhock naturally flows into the Whiteshell River anyway, so all we're doing is taking a little bit of water for our own use, using it, and then shooting it right back where it was going to go. The Whiteshell River behind me here is also stocked with trout every year, but there are a couple of special fishing rules that you have to abide by when you're here. For starters, we don't let people gain access through the hatchery. You can take the Kingfisher Angler Access Road, which is right up by the bridge, and all trout are catch and release. Now, we don't just have the Whiteshell Fish Hatchery to thank for all these wonderful trout. The Manitoba Fly Fishing Association has helped out as well over the years. For example, in the Whiteshell River, they've done things like adding layers of rock to the river and even intentionally sinking some logs to provide some cover and potential spawning habitat for trout. Well, that's all about there is to see outside, so now, as promised, we're going to head inside the main hatchery building to take a look at what really goes on here, especially in winter. And we just happened to luck out. We arrived on the day that the Whiteshell Fish Hatchery receives its rainbow trout eggs. So let's head inside and take a look. I'm here now with the operations manager of the Whiteshell Fish Hatchery, Kevin Dick. Kevin, thanks for letting us come inside and take a look at the inside of the hatchery today. My first question for you is, if you could just take us through sort of the major projects that take place here at the hatchery as we go from season to season.
Well, let's start in the spring where we have our walleye spawn cap and hatching. That runs from about mid-April till the end of May. We usually produce around 10 to 13 million walleye eggs and fry. During that same time, we start with our spring distribution, where we'll stock pretty much across the province with the fish that are held over the winter, so up to about 180,000 this spring. Then we'll have our fall stocking, and that'll probably be around 300,000 trout around Manitoba. At the same time, in the fall, we'll also be doing our spawning of our brown and brook brood stocks, and crossing them and also making it what is called a tagger trout. Every second year we go to the pond and Clearwater Lake to retrieve lake trout eggs and also cross them with brook trout to make splake. Those are kind of our major operations, and the rest of the time during the winter is taking care of all the eggs and fry that we have, which is daily cleaning and feedings.
Okay, so that's pretty much all that's happening at the hatchery right now in February, just kind of cleaning tanks and just sort of general maintenance?
Yeah, cleaning, feeding, general maintenance, picking up the dead, making sure the water quality is good.
Okay, very cool, thank you. All right, now I'm here with hatchery assistant Trevor Awonko. So Trevor, I imagine with some of the tasks that Kevin just talked about here at the hatchery, the tools that you guys need are probably a little bit different than the tools, say, in the back of my truck. So could you just kind of take us through the things you have on the table here?
Well, this is just, I guess, a few of the things that we'd be using here on pretty much a daily basis. Most of it all has to do with water quality and testing equipment. So, and as well as fish, doing weights and measures on the fish as well for calculating feed amounts. So I guess with weights and measures, we'd be using a fish scale here, which is just a water scale for measuring kilos of fish. Also, we have a little measuring stick for doing lengths. As far as water testing, we monitor the dissolved oxygen levels in the tank. So we have a DO tester. Also, temperature gauges. pH. For treatments, we'll do a salt treatments, and for that we have a refractometer for measuring saline, and have an ammonia meter, as well as UVT.
Okay. You had mentioned you do some salt treatments. What is the salt treatment for, and what types of fish would you use that on?
We basically use salt on all the fish here. It's just more of a preventative, it's a natural cleaning, I guess, that we would use for just treating the fish.
Okay. Kind of like giving them sort of an antibacterial bath kind of thing?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. One last thing. You mentioned UVT. What is that?
So the UVT, we have, for downstairs, we have UV lamps, which are for filtering the water. And the UVT is just a measure of the transmission through the water, which we have to plug into the computer. So it works with the UV itself.
Okay. Oh, very cool, very cool. Thanks for showing us this.
All right.
Now, lastly, I'm here with Bill Sorensen, hatchery technician here at the Whiteshell Fish Hatchery. So, Bill, we're in the feed room right now, another building behind the main building of the hatchery we were just in. So, could you give us a little bit of a rundown of how and when the fish get fed here at the hatchery?
Okay, so this is our feed room where we get the food ready every morning to feed the outside fish. So right now the fish are probably getting fed 3 times a day. There's different size of feeds that we use, so I'll just give you a little rundown on the feed here. This is called a 9PT floating pellet, and that would be for our brood stock. And then we have a 3PT. This would be for our 18 plus fish that will be stocked out probably this spring.
Okay. Very cool, something to look forward to. Now, before you stock the fish out, do you put them through any kind of fast at all?
We try not to feed them for 2 days. Then it just keeps the water, transport water, cleaner as we're taking them out.
Okay. Yeah, definitely I could see it being a benefit on those long trips that truck has to go on.
Yep, for sure.
Alrighty. Well, thank you very much for sharing that with us, Bill.
No problem.
Well, that was a really cool in-depth look at how the fish hatchery actually operates. I want to thank all the staff here at the Whiteshell Fish Hatchery for allowing me to come in and take this behind-the-scenes look, and I can't wait to come back in the spring to see how big those little fry got.
There we are. The Whiteshell Fish Hatchery still to this day is one of my favorite places to go. It's where I started in parks back in 2007, and now here I am talking about it year-round. But after that, I'm sure everybody is now wondering a very common question. Where can I go to catch all these fish? Well, for first-time fishers, there's a great place. There's a number of great places all over the province, but in the Whiteshell, a really easy place to access is Lions Lake, which is right off Highway 1. It's a very small lake, and you actually don't need a watercraft to fish there. You use a very large dock there that goes out onto the lake, as well as a fishing platform that people can fish from as well. And because it's such a small lake in winter, if you're going to go ice fishing, you don't really need a sled or a truck. You can just walk to your location. All you need is an auger. Things that are in there are fish like rainbow trout, brown trout, and brook trout here that have been stocked from the fish hatchery. There's also yellow perch and some bullhead in that lake as well. And by just going out and fishing, that's a great way to show appreciation for the Whiteshell Fish Hatchery and all the hard work that the staff does. When you're out fishing, it is very important, though, and required, to follow all the fishing rules and regulations in Manitoba. Now, there are lots of them that you can find in our angler's guide that you can find on the Manitoba Fisheries website. But one that I'll talk about right now, because it is a fairly important one, and if anybody does fish, you know what I'm going to talk about, and that is fishing with a barbless hook. So when you buy a hook in the store, they always come, or most time, come with a barb on them. Now, in theory, it kind of makes sense. The idea behind a barb is that when it pierces the fish's mouth, it prevents it from being able to spit the lure out very easily. Kind of sounds all right in theory, but if you're catch and release fishing, or if you happen to hook an endangered species like the lake sturgeon there, removing a barbed hook from a fish's mouth can actually sometimes cause a lot of damage. And damage to a fish's mouth is pretty much a death sentence, which is not good for any of them, but especially endangered fish. So how do you debarb a hook? Easiest thing in the world. Need this fancy tool here. Very good tool to have in any tackle box. You just take the needle nose pliers and crimp that barb up until it's flush along with the rest of the hook. Easy way to test that you've actually got it flush with the rest of the hook. Take it and run it along the front of your thumbnail. And if you've got no scratch there, it's good to go. If it does leave a little scratch, for starters, don't worry, it won't hurt. It just means you got to crimp it just a little bit tighter. Failure to do so will land you a $52 fine, and your fishing equipment may be confiscated by conservation officers. So it's a lot easier just to take that 5 seconds to debarb that hook before you go fishing. And now I will answer one more question that I know everyone's thinking of. I get it a million times at the hatchery. I live on such and such lake. What do you put in it? The easiest way to find out is, again, to go to our Manitoba Fisheries website, and actually right next to where the Angler's Guide link is, below it is a link for lake information for anglers. You click on that and it's got a comprehensive interactive map that shows you where fish have been stocked in Manitoba since 1917. I've been checking it out the last couple of days, and it's a really cool tool. If you want to know more about where fish have been stocked out, go check out that website. It's awesome. One last thing that everybody can do come summertime, if you're interested more in fish as well as the fish hatchery, is you can visit the fish hatchery. The Fish Hatchery Interpretive Center is open for tours from the May long weekend to the September long weekend. Information and registration is available at manitobaparks.com, as well as our Manitoba Facebook page. The important thing to remember when we're out fishing is, obviously, yes, we want to social distance from people not in our household, as the COVID restrictions currently, but we also want to treat the fish with a lot of care and respect, because a lot of care and respect was put into putting a lot of those fish out there, so we want to keep that going. Now, I want to thank you all very much for listening to me this morning. And now, if anybody has any questions, if you haven't already, type them into the Q&A section, and we'll do our best to answer them for you.
Thank you, Adam. Our first question is from Donna, who asks, do you ever get predators invading the outside tanks or races, such as bears, eagles, osprey, or other animals?
So the short answer is yes. Pretty much every animal that predates on fish shows up at the hatchery at some point. The long tanks, the raceways that we saw first, they've actually got big black nets that roll up over the tanks to keep aerial predators out. During the day, when, especially in the summer when we have tours going on, as well as just general hatchery staff coming and going, there's usually enough commotion to keep the aerial predators away. But at night, when everyone's gone, we roll the nets over so they can't get in. But for other things like bears, marten, yes, they do, or not marten, sorry, mink, they do show up occasionally. But an interesting note with the bears, they're actually not, we find, not attracted to the smell of the fish, but they're actually attracted to the smell of the fish food. This is why when everybody's gone for the day, all the fish food is locked up in our feed building where animals can't gain access to. But yeah, the fish hatchery is not just a great place to come see fish, but a great place to come see a lot of different aerial types of birds as well.
Our next question is from Hilda, who asks, will there ever be a time in the near future when we would be able to keep a sturgeon for consumption? Could there be offered a draw tag for them?
Off the top of my head, I don't know if that'll ever happen. Lake sturgeon are still an endangered species. Their numbers have been improving and doing better over the last couple of decades, but as far as there being a tag system or a draw system for that, off the top of my head, I don't know if that's in the near future.
Gordon asks, how do you decide what lakes are stocked and when?
Okay, so when we want to go stocking into a lake, one of the first things the hatchery staff has to do, especially if it's a new lake that hasn't been stocked before, is they have to do a survey. And this is actually where our fisheries guys will come out and survey the lake. Now, one of the reasons we do this is because the rainbow trout and the brown trout, two of the very common trout that are stocked out, are not native to Manitoba. We talked a little bit about how the brown trout isn't native to North America, actually. The rainbow trout is also not native to Manitoba. The reason, by the way, that non-native species are introduced is just to give the angler a better variety of fish to catch. But here's the trick and why we do surveys. For southern Manitoba, like I said, the lake trout here is the only native trout we'd have down here. So if they do a survey and we find lake trout in that water body, game over. We don't want to introduce any non-native species into a water body where there are already a native species, because we don't want to risk them out-competing the native ones. The only other native trout species are things like brook trout and Arctic char, but they're both native to up in northern Manitoba, up around Churchill.
The next question is from Val, who asks, what is the fish food made from?
So the fish food is made from, it's a combination of two things. Some type of ground up fish, not the kinds of fish behind here, we're not cannibalizing them, and whey powder, which is basically just protein. So they're basically good little protein shakes or protein nuggets for the fish that help them grow very strong and very fast.
Mary asks, when you go fishing, does it hurt the fish?
When the hook goes through the fish's mouth, far as we can tell, it doesn't really hurt them. It's an inconvenience. They're being pulled out of their home, but doesn't, as far as I'm aware, it doesn't hurt, unless there are some other opinions out there towards that.
Question from Brock, who asks, is the Whiteshell River the only catch and release location for trout?
Short answer again is no. It's one of the areas around the Whiteshell that's catch and release, but this is why we publish an angler's guide every year. The rules vary and change as you move all throughout the province. So in all likelihood, there are other areas that are catch and release for trout, but off the top of my head, I can't think of any at this time, but I guarantee you there are definitely some.
Jennifer asks, what is your favorite fish and why?
My favorite fish is the first one we showed you, the black crappie, because even though it's a relatively small one, it is the best tasting one, in my opinion. Taste is subjective. For example, I like black coffee, but the black crappie is my favorite fish because it is the tastiest.
Pat asks, can you buy fry from the hatchery to stock at your pond at home?
So because the Whiteshell Fish Hatchery is a provincial sport fish hatchery, we don't do any commercial or any private sales. So I get that phone call a lot, people asking me, I have a pond or some place on my private property that I want to stock. And the fish hatchery, again, does not do private sales. They release fish strictly for people to go catch.
Vig asks, how would a fisheries person survey the species in a lake? Is it sonar or some other visual technology?
So one of the ways that they survey either a lake or river is they actually use electroshock. Now that sounds big and scary, but what happens is when they're going to go out on a lake, they have a boat that basically has a bunch of wires dangling down, and it emits a small amount of electricity that stuns the fish. So they float to the surface just for a little bit, long enough for the surveyors to see what comes up, then they swim away fine. So from sampling lakes like that, they can get a good estimation of what kinds of fish are in that area. In a river, especially because they're a lot more shallow, it's a little more interesting. They use, I call them the Ghostbuster guns. The fish hatchery or the fishery staff are actually in the water with a pack on their back and a wand that they put in the water that does the same thing as the boat. It emits a small amount of electricity. The fish float to the surface, and you can go, okay, 1 pike, 2 pike, 1 walleye, 2 perch, and you can get a sample of what kind of fish are in that water body.
How would a student go about getting a job at the hatchery? What kind of schooling would be required?
So definitely things in either the biology or chemistry field definitely help, as well as experience. There are different opportunities at the hatchery, depending on year to year, to work there as a summer student. Sometimes they get what's called a green team position that basically helps them with a lot of minor maintenance stuff throughout the summer. But that's a good foot in the door for gaining some experience at working at a hatchery.
Donna asks, what kinds of diseases, pathogens, or parasites do you have to deal with at the hatchery?
So off the top of my head, I do not know. I do know that what happens is, especially with our brood stock and really all the fish that we're going to release, if any of them die, all of it is cataloged, because when you got 30,000 fish in a tank, clearly some are going to die. All the fish that pass away are cataloged and kept just so we can get a survival rate for what our fish are, how our fish are surviving at the hatchery, which, as far as I'm aware, is about 85%, which is much better than in the wild. Occasionally, with some of our brood stock, what'll happen? Sometimes they can get, when they get a little bit older, they'll get a bit of a what looks like a fungal growth at points on their back. And anytime a brood stock dies, the fish will actually be taken into the hatchery, and they'll actually perform an autopsy on it to see exactly what killed it, and if it is something that we need to worry about.
Donna also asks, once a lake or stream is stocked, does it have to be restocked, or will the fish repopulate themselves?
So it depends on what kind of fish are being stocked out. For things like the walleye here, walleye are a native Manitoba fish, so they are actually capable of reproducing on their own. But because of how small the fish are, when I say, the fish fry, they're about that big when they're released. So if we put 300,000 or 500,000 in a lake, we're not too sure how many actually make it to adulthood. But one of the reasons that we keep restocking the same lakes as far as the walleye go is that we want there to be a constant good population in there, because they are such a popular fish people want to fish for. For other things like the rainbow trout and the brown trout, like I said, they're not native to Manitoba, and we found they don't really reproduce that well on their own in the wild. There's a couple of exceptions for the rainbow trout. There's a few spots throughout Manitoba where they have been documented to reproduce on their own, but that's the main reason why things like the brown and the rainbow trout are stocked out in the same places, because they're not native to this area, and for the most part, they don't reproduce on their own. So if we didn't stock them out into those places year after year, they wouldn't be available for people to catch.
Heather asks, is the whiteshell the only fish hatchery in Manitoba for stocking lakes?
No, there are a couple of other hatcheries. Another main one is actually up at Grand Rapids. Grand Rapids, the hatchery there will stock out things like lake trout. They also do some lake sturgeon as well as walleye.
Okay. Can you repeat the crosses of the hybrid trout and their names?
Absolutely. So again, the brook trout milt is a universal donor, we call it. And when you mix it with the trout egg, you get the hybrids. With a lake trout, you get a splake trout. And then with a rainbow trout, you get a spur. With an Arctic char, you get a spar. And then with a brown trout, you get a tiger trout.
Mary asks, is the sturgeon the biggest kind of fish in Canada?
In Canada, yes. Now, there are different types of sturgeon. In Manitoba, we just have the lake sturgeon. There are other places, I believe out in places like British Columbia, where they have the white sturgeon that can actually get twice as big as the lake sturgeon that we have here. But as far as Manitoba goes, the lake sturgeon is the largest. Because like I said, at some point in the beginning, the biggest lake sturgeon and the biggest freshwater fish ever caught in Manitoba was that lake sturgeon. It was in 1903, actually. And again, weighed 405 pounds and was estimated to be about 9 feet long. The sturgeon in general, they're very, very unique fish. They're long living fish and they can get very, very large. The funny thing is, out of a lot of the sturgeon species, the lake sturgeon are actually some of the smaller ones.
Val asks, does stocking fish hurt the native fish?
As far as we can tell, no, it doesn't. Again, because with things like the rainbow and brown trout, they don't reproduce on their own. So we don't have to worry about them, overtaking a population. But surveys are done in lakes to monitor periodically how they're doing. But as far as we can tell, where we do release things like non-native fish, they are able to live in harmony with the types of native fish that we have.
Francis asks, why do you crossbreed trout?
We crossbreed trout essentially for the same reason that we introduce rainbow or brown trout into water bodies. It's just to give anglers a greater variety of fish to catch. One thing I will point actually out about the hybrids is, with the exception of the splake trout, none of the hybrids can reproduce. They're all sterile. So it's not like we have to worry about tiger trout suddenly overtaking an entire lake. They will not reproduce.
Okay. Do you know how many types of fish there are in Manitoba?
At last count, it's over 100. And I think the last count, including hybrids, I think it was I want to say 106 or 107, but it's definitely over 100 species.
What is the biggest fish you've ever caught, and where did you catch it?
The biggest fish I've ever caught was a 22-inch freshwater drum, and I caught it off of one of the piers at Lake Winnipeg when I was 19 years old, I think. It's getting farther and farther back there.
Ryder asks, how long has the lake sturgeon been on the endangered list?
Few decades for sure, but oddly enough, not as long as you would think. For example, there was actually just like there's a commercial fishery for walleye, there was a commercial fishery for sturgeon, and that didn't close until 1993. So the sturgeon is on the endangered species list, but hasn't really been there for that long. I guess a few decades, but in the grand scheme.
Gordon asks, have the number of trout stocked increased, decreased, or remained the same over the last 10 years? What are the future plans for the hatchery?
So the answer is yes, yes, and yes. Again, depending on what lake or water body you're talking about, some years, maybe some trout get put in higher numbers, some year in lower numbers. Because of the vast array of water bodies that are stocked by the Whiteshell Fish Hatchery, best way to answer that question would be to go to our fisheries website and go to that interactive map that I showed you, or I told you about, and you can see where fish have been stocked out and if numbers have been going up or going down.
Paul asks, do you continue to stock exotic species that reproduce, like bass or crappie?
At the moment, at the Whiteshell Fish Hatchery, no. Smallmouth bass, at least as long as I've been there, have not been stocked out. And black crappie are actually a native Manitoba species.
Does crossbreeding trout occur naturally?
As far as we can tell, no. They're strictly, the hybrids that I was talking about, they are strictly man-made hybrids. Human-made hybrids.
Okay. Where do you release char?
So Arctic char, again, off the top of my head, I'm not too sure because they haven't released strictly Arctic char out of the hatchery for a number of years. I think it's actually getting up to almost a decade now. So again, the easiest way I can answer is to check out the that interactive map on the fisheries website. Because again, the most common thing they would use char for in the last periods that they had char was to make hybrids and not releasing strictly Arctic char.
And a couple people have asked, how would you get a local pond stocked in a town?
Depending on what kind of fish you want to put in there, best thing to do is work with the whatever conservation district you're in, and they can point you in the right direction in terms of if you're going to be putting exotic species or whatever species you're going to be putting in there. Dealing with your conservation district is the first place to go to.
Okay, that wraps up our questions.
Alrighty. Well, those are all really good questions. And again, I want to thank you all very much for joining me this morning. And when you do come out to parks, be sure to follow public COVID-19 health orders. And if this has made you hungry for more webinars, we will have more coming up in March. Details and registration will all be available at manitobaparks.com or on our Manitoba Parks Facebook page. But once again, thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see some of you at the hatchery this summer. Take care and stay safe at home.